Right, good morning, Inan. So, what we're going to do today is something a little bit different. We've been looking at the British and the American side of the Second World War, and I know we've only just started the American side with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but what we're going to do today is we're going to move forward chronologically into another part of the Second World War, and we're going to move towards looking at the Eastern Front, what happens in sort of Eastern Europe with the Battle of Stalingrad, which is one of the bloodiest and most violent battles that happens throughout the entire war. But what I'd first like you to do today is to write the numbers 1 to 7 down the side of your page. And what I'm going to do is, as I read out each statement, I would like to write down next to that number whether you think each statement is true or false. And then this will act as your recap quiz for this lesson. So, number 1. The knife World War One soldiers attached to the end of their guns was known as a Bowie knife, or a Bowie knife. Number 2. Militarism describes the desire to build an empire, so a country wanting to build an empire. Number 3. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in the year 1919. Number 4. The USA was the leading country in the League of Nations. Number 5. Benito Mussolini was the communist dictator of Spain. Number 6. Communism is a right-wing ideology. And number 7. The Cap Putsch happened in 1920. Once you have answered all those, we're going to move on to the next slide and go through the answers very quickly. I would like you to mark your answers in green pen like you should normally do in a lesson. So, the first one we've got, the knife World War One soldiers attached to the ends of their guns was known as a Bowie knife. That is false. It is called a bayonet. Militarism, number 2, militarism describes a desire to build an empire. That is also false. The term we use to build wanting to build an empire is imperialism. Number 3, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. That is true. Number 4, the USA was the leading country in the League of Nations. That is false. I hope you can all remember that is because the USA was never part of the League of Nations. Number 5, Benito Mussolini was the communist dictator of Spain. That is false. Benito Mussolini was the fascist dictator of Italy. Number 6, communism is a right-wing ideology. That is also false. Communism is the extreme of left-wing thinking, so it's a left-wing ideology. And finally, number 7, the Cap Putsch happened in 1920. That is true. So, what I would like to do now is, on your page, I would like to write your title for me. Why was the Battle of Stalingrad so bloody and violent? What I'd like to do as well is to write down your keywords. So we've got Red Army, which is the name the USSR, the Russia at this time uses for their army. We've got Encircled, which means to be surrounded by an opponent on all sides. And we've got Hero, a person who is admired for their courage, outstanding achievements, or their noble qualities. So, as we know, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany following the evacuation of Dunkirk. France had fallen. The USA was later brought into the war after the Japanese attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. However, in the early stage of the war, Hitler did not wish to fight against the Russians, which is the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In fact, Hitler and Stalin, the leader of the USSR, signed a non-aggression pact, like we know, and agreed to divide Poland following Nazi Germany's invasion, which is what you can see on the cartoon there, with Hitler and Stalin saluting each other, even though they're saying quite horrible things to each other, and with Poland, a Polish soldier dead in the middle. So it's sort of saying like they're working together while not liking each other. and this allowed Hitler to concentrate on his campaign against Western Europe and particularly defeating France and Britain. However, Hitler had not forgotten his foreign policy aim of Lebensraum, which, if you remember, that is wanting to expand the land that Germany owns so that German people have more space to live in. And he also wanted to defeat the threat of communism, because it's the opposite of what fascism is, and Nazism is a part of fascism. Throughout the first half of 1941, Hitler began the preparations to invade Russia. So although they were technically working together to start with and they'd signed this non-aggression pact, Hitler was still preparing to invade. He was still preparing to stab Stalin in the back. But by June, Hitler had amassed over 3 million German troops on the border and the USSR, on the border of the USSR, and was ready to invade. And at the same time, he had over 600,000 motor vehicles and over 600,000 horses for non-combat operations. So he's planning this huge invasion with a huge army, and then he's planning to stay there as well. So he's taking all the supplies he needs to stay in Russia once he's invaded. On Sunday the 22nd of June 1941, and under the codename Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany launched the invasion of the USSR with the largest force in the history of warfare. That is what we're going to be studying now. We're going to look at what happens after this. So what happens when the Nazis launched this invasion and after they've been fighting the Russians for some time. So the first thing I would like you to do is I would like you to copy down the mind map, the Battle of Stalingrad. And what we're going to do is we're going to discuss some events, and in particular I'm going to show you a video in a minute. And I would like to write down anything you learn from this video onto your mind map. So while we are watching this video, which you can find by clicking on the link, just add in what you can find out about the Battle of Stalingrad, as much information as you can get before we talk about it as a class. You will need to pause the video you're listening to now so you can watch that. So now you've watched that video, we're going to go through and talk about it together. So as we know, it was vital that the USSR, that they did not lose the city of Stalingrad to the advancing German army, because it bore the name of their leader, Joseph Stalin. And what I mean by that is Stalin had taken the name, his own name, and applied it to a city, giving it the name Stalingrad. So what I'd like to ask you, and what I'd like you to write down, is how would it look on Stalin if he'd lost a city that shared his name? And what effect could this have on the morale of Russian soldiers? And by that means, how would the Russian soldiers feel if Stalin cannot even keep a city with his own name on it? And because of this, Stalin ordered that the Red Army, the Soviet Russian army, hold the city no matter what. And this led to some of the most horrific and violent fighting of the whole war, because neither side would relent. Stalin could not lose this city, and Hitler could not back off from his invasion because he knew Russia would counterattack and he would probably end up losing the war. Now, the desperation of the Soviet Union to defeat the German army meant that there was no or very little gender division in the Red Army. This is probably one of the more gender, I suppose you could see it kind of as gender equality, because it's letting women fight as well, whereas in Britain it was predominantly men that did fight, and women were used to dig things like trenches, and some were even used as machine gunners, snipers, and artillery gunners. In some attacks, there were reports that the Red Army's commanders would force their soldiers to charge forward and shoot any soldier caught retreating. So that is, they would push their soldiers forward, and any soldiers that decide to run back towards their commanders or try and run away from the Germans, they were then shot by their Russian commander. And it would have been classed as an act of cowardice, and it would have been seen as a deserved death. And the number of dead and wounded was very immense. In fact, the Axis, which is Germany and its allies, suffered somewhere between 647,300 to 968,374 total casualties. Now, the reason there's about a 300,000 difference there is because we're not entirely sure. Some bodies were lost and never found. Some people ran away, that we don't know whether they died or they just deserted. So it's quite a big gap. The Soviet Union suffered a lot more casualties than Germany did, with an even bigger gap. So, for example, there were 1,129,619 total casualties, which included 478,741 soldiers killed or missing, with 650,878 wounded or sick. So the Russians sustained a lot more casualties than the Germans did, and they also had a lot more damage caused. However, despite the significant high number of casualties, the Red Army did eventually defeat the German forces. It did this by surrounding them and cutting them off from their supply lines. And additionally, despite Hitler promising to drop supplies from planes through airdrops, only half of the supplies Hitler promised actually made it to his soldiers in Stalingrad. This, combined with the extremely cold weather, for which the Germans were not prepared for, had a significant effect on the morale of soldiers trying to take the city of Stalingrad. Now, what I'd like you to answer is, what effect would the lack of supplies and weather have on the morale of the German troops? Why would it have this effect? And why would this be a problem for any commander trying to command German soldiers to fight against the Russians? What I'd like to do now we've completed as my map and we've got all that key information, is I'd like to take advantage of the fact that we're all working from home, and the fact that if you have access to this lesson, you clearly have internet access. So I'm going to ask you to do a bit of your own research. In particular, I'm going to ask you to research one soldier, a famous sniper from the Battle of Stalingrad. And this sniper's name is Vasily Zaitsev. So you're going to use the internet to answer these questions. You will not be able to use the internet to answer all of them, because some of them depend on your opinion. So, number one, I'd like you to find out from the internet, how did Vasily Zaitsev become a hero to the Soviet Union and the Red Army? Number two, how did the Soviet Union present Zaitsev as a hero to the Red Army? So how did they make him famous? Number three, and this sort of comes into your own ideas plus what you can find on the internet, why did the Soviet Union present him as a hero to the Red Army? And number four, how would the Red Army react to seeing one of their own hailed as this huge hero for his effort during the Battle of Stalingrad? And that's your opinion, number four. Number four is pretty much your own view on why they would make him such a hero. Now we've done that and we've got some key information, some specific factual detail on the Battle of Stalingrad, and we've also done his own research on a key figure during the Battle of Stalingrad in the form of Vasily Zaitsev. We're now going to look at a key historical skill of interpretations. And I know we've all done these before in lessons, because me, Mr. Fisher and Miss Hardwick love these, and it is a very key skill, particularly to those of you taking history at GCSE next year. So what you'll see here is I've given you an interpretation of the Battle of Stalingrad. And the first thing I'd like to do is to read it very carefully, okay? So it reads, the main reason why the Red Army emerged victorious during the Battle of Stalingrad was because of the determination of Stalin not to lose a city which shared his name. Should this city have been lost, then the humiliation for the Soviet Union would have obliterated the morale of their soldiers and seriously damaged the defence against the advancing German army. In fact, Stalin became so determined that any sign of cowardice or retreat was not tolerated by the Red Army commanders, who shot those running, and by doing this he forced his own men to fight on. So now we've read that interpretation, what I would like you to do is, number one, if you can't print this off, I'd just like to write the numbers in your book to answer these questions. So number one, I would like to very briefly summarise what that interpretation is saying in no more than 15 words. So what is Julia Marie Johnson trying to argue in no more than 15 words? Number two, I would like to use any evidence you have learnt this lesson from either the video or my notes or your own research on Vasily Zaitsev, and I would like to write, what evidence can you use to support this interpretation? So what can you use to prove that Julia Marie Johnson is right. Number 3, I would like you then to do the opposite. So I'd like to know what evidence can you use that proves Julia Marie Johnson to be wrong. And then number 4, the last one, I would like to tell me to what extent do you agree with Julia Marie Johnson and why. And that is a very important skill. Do you agree with an interpretation or not? And then the last thing I would like to do is I would like you to answer today's inquiry question. So why was the Battle of Stalingrad so bloody and violent? And the challenge is I would like to give me the best explanation to this question, but I would like you to use no more than 20 words to do it. Once you have done that, please remember to either take a picture of your work if you've handwritten it, or to attach it to an email and send it me so I can tick it off. This is all working towards a piece of extended writing we're going to do on the Second World War. It's called a narrative account, and I'll be giving each and every one of you that sends me that when I give it out quite in-depth feedback on how to improve in your history writing. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson.